Hi, I'm Jessie. I'm the Executive Vice President of HelpSeeker and one of our nonprofit and social policy experts. This is part one of a four-part series where I'll walk you through how service provider organizations can use Karto, our newly launched data platform, to make stronger proposals, applications for funding, presentations to board, and create effective advocacy campaigns. In this demo, I'm going to demonstrate how Karto can be used for funding advocacy when making the case for a new type of service in your community. Here we have four use case scenarios, ways that we think service providers can use Karto to their advantage. The first one we're going to cover today is funding advocacy. So when a service provider organization wants to make a case for a new type of service or even an expansion of a service, how can Karto data be most useful? In this example, the Red Door Youth Shelter is seeing an increase in the number of refugees using their services. They would like to make the case to funders for a 6-bed transitional housing program, which supports refugee youth for at least a year, focusing on culturally specific and culturally safe supports. Let's look at the data that's available to the Red Door Youth Shelter to make the case to funders. So first, there's client data. If the Red Door Youth Shelter has access to a CRM, and they keep their records updated, they'll have client demographic data that shows a 25% year-over-year increase of refugee youth coming to the emergency shelter. That tells us specifically what the service is experiencing, but what information is available to suggest that isn't a blip, or that this is just a one-time experience of a particular provider. Next, we can look at social trend data. So that's online research that might show that refugee youth might continue to seek services at an increased rate. So we do online research and we find that immigration is expected to increase over the next 3 years. So the social trend data is validating the client data. Next, there's personal stories. So qualitative data is powerful, particularly when coupled with quantitative data that shows that there's a segment of the population who requires a particular support that is not presently available. The challenge of this is what it doesn't talk about is what already exists in the social infrastructure. So to make the case that new beds or new supports are needed, we need to somehow show that there's an under-resource or underfunding of a particular support within the community. This is where Karto becomes a powerful tool. Here's your first look at Karto. So what is Karto in a nutshell? It's a digital platform that provides you access to the largest data set on social supports in Canada. With over 100,000 organizations, programs, and services listed, combined with never-before-seen analysis of charitable funding, Karto is an invaluable tool for designing, funding, and advocating for services that meet client needs. But we know this type of data is new. So let me walk you through how I would use it if I worked for Red Door Youth Shelter and were advocating for more supports. First, we'll go to supply and demand analytics. This allows you to access across the country the organization's programs, services that are available in every community. On my home screen here, I see a summary of Ottawa's social infrastructure. I'm going to move to Toronto by typing in here. And the map will change. We're able to see the geographic distribution of all 5,000 listings across Toronto. Currently, we have a tag specifically dedicated to transitional housing. So I'm going to click here. From here, I can see there's 121 listings tagged with transitional housing. I can also scroll over these blue dots to see what these services are. So here we can see the Breaking Barriers program, which clearly states it's a transitional housing program for individuals. This is helpful and this is really great actually if you're making referrals and you want to find which services are located where, but it doesn't tell us anything about refugees specifically. Here though, I can go to population distribution, and this looks at the service tags such as transitional housing relative to our population tags. And here we have some of our population tags on the left. What I'm able to see is that for transitional housing, there's relatively few services tagged relative to other basic needs categories. And I can see 40 listings that are attributed to both youth and transitional housing. Interestingly, though, if I move to refugee and here newcomer and immigrant, there are very few listings, 8 and 9. So what do we do with that information? If I wanted to capture these in the findings, something I could do is take a screenshot of it, or I might choose to describe the findings like this. So according to the largest data set on social supports in Canada, 40 of 5,000 listings reference transitional housing programs for youth, yet less than 10 provide refugee-specific support. We know from research that transitional housing is more effective than short-term housing for youth, and this data indicates there may be a gap for refugee and newcomer youth in regards to secondary prevention and housing supports. So let's move to another feature and see what additional evidence we can find to support our case. I'm going to go back to the homepage and then back to the supply and demand analytics. This time, instead of going to supply mix, I'm going to go to a feature called service gaps and duplication. This is a more detailed look, and we use a data set of actually over 6.2 million words to give you, and as well as your funders, a more detailed picture of what exists in the community. So here we're looking at Toronto's housing and homelessness continuum. We also have the mental health and addictions continuum. We're working on a domestic violence and safety continuum, and food is to come soon after. So what this provides is, again, a detailed look at a particular topic within a community. So if we go to housing with supports, we can see that transitional housing here is roughly 11.5% of all housing and homelessness listings in Toronto. So we can see that's fewer than some of the other categories in housing with supports, such as accessible housing or safe housing. If we go to the emergency shelter program category, we can see that our emergency shelter is 34.9% of the total listings. So how does that help our case? It is an extraordinarily important to look at the number of services or percentage of services that are dedicated to sort of an essential crisis response, such as emergency shelter, and what percentage of services are dedicated to secondary or tertiary prevention of homelessness or longer term supports. In a well-functioning system, we need both are essential. And then this data helps us to understand what proportion of each we have. So what would I say about that? I may indicate, if I was the Red Door Youth Shelter, that there's a lack of prevention-focused services. So in Toronto, 34% of help seeker listings are emergency-based housing. Conversely, only 11.5% provide transitional housing. We know that investing in prevention-based services, such as transitional housing for youth, creates better outcomes and prevents longer, more traumatic experiences of homelessness. Red Door Youth Shelter will continue to provide emergency beds for youth that are seeking short-term support, but a dedicated transitional housing program for refugee youth will allow us to support youth at risk of trauma, violence, or systemic discrimination with the stability of a multi-year stay. Next, I'm going to show you how to look at the same data, the detailed housing and homelessness continuum, but look at population instead of program category, like transitional housing. So on the same screen, we'll move to the second tab, population and location detail. And here we can see listing by population, and these populations have been extracted from, as I mentioned, that 6.2 million word data set. So if we go to refugees here, we can zoom in, should we wish. We can see that, as validated before on the program category, there's nothing for tagged refugees for transitional housing using this data set. So again, that just validates the same point in the findings that we made in the previous one. If your topic of concern is mental health and addictions, or again, as I mentioned, the forthcoming topics, you can also view population by those as well. Next, I want to be able to paint a picture about how much funding is or isn't going to programs similar to transitional housing for refugee youth. And for us to do that, we'll navigate to a different feature. So back to the homepage, supply and demand analytics, funding by program type. We'll toggle to Toronto. We'll also pick our area of concern. For this use case, we're focusing on housing and homelessness, but there's more areas of concern to come. So I can see for charities, there's 167 charities that are providing some sort of services or supports in housing and homelessness, totaling 1.3 billion in revenue in 2019. What we're able to do with this data set that's never been done before is to look at the detailed program categories. So specifically for transitional housing, we can go to program type. And we can see transitional housing is on that list because we've already identified it previously. So I'm able to click that and see that $202 million went to organizations providing some sort of transitional housing supports. I can also see by levels of government who contributed the most to what extent. So municipal contributions were around 52 million, whereas federal contributions were only 11 million. You can also see which organizations were providing those type of supports. So what do we do with this data? I go back to my findings, and I would suggest that transitional housing may be underfunded relative to other parts of the continuum. So of the 1.3 billion that went to charities providing housing and homelessness support, make sure I have my numbers right, 202. So 202 million is being directed towards organizations providing transitional housing support in 2019. What this allows us to do, if you want to be more detailed, is look at other types of housing support within the continuum and make comparisons as to which is being most funded or least funded. This is just one of the many use cases for Karto. When it comes to advocacy and funding applications, this data can help you to make a case for support that stands out from other requests. It's as a B Corp, it's our mission to make this data as accessible as possible so that we collectively can make more informed decisions about social infrastructure planning and meet the changing needs in our communities. If you'd like to access Karto, you can find more information at helpseeker.co/Karto, or you can email me directly at jessie@helpseeker.org. Stay tuned for the next 3 parts where I go through more use cases for Karto and how it can be used for service planning and organizational design.